You've seen the image 100 times, right? The president sitting at a big desk, surrounded by cameras, signing a piece of paper with a whole bunch of pens. It's the ultimate picture of power, that stroke of the pen that looks like it can change the world in an instant.
But what really happens when the cameras go away? Is that signature like a king's decree, an absolute command? Or is the reality, well, a lot more complicated? That's what we're going to get into. What can a president really do with just a pen? And what are the powerful, often hidden, checks that can stop that signature cold? All right, let's dive in.
We're going to break this all down into 5 main parts. First up, we'll tackle that stroke of the pen myth. Then, we'll open up the legal rulebook that defines the president's power. After that, we'll look at the ultimate check on that power. Then, we'll see how this all plays out with some real-world examples. And finally, we'll talk about why these big actions, well, they aren't always permanent.
Okay, Section 1, the stroke of the pen myth. Before we can even talk about the limits on presidential power, we have to know what we're talking about. What is the president actually signing?
So, there are a few different tools in the toolbox. The most famous is the executive order. It's formal, it gets a number, and it has to be published for everyone to see. But then there's the presidential memorandum. Functionally, it's pretty much the same thing, but it's a bit more under the radar since it doesn't always have to be published. And get this, a huge policy like DACA was created with a memorandum, not an executive order. Finally, you've got proclamations. A lot of these are ceremonial, but they can pack a real legal punch, especially with things like international trade or immigration.
Now listen up, because this is the single most important rule of the entire game. For any of these documents to have the force of law, the president's power has to come from somewhere. It has to be tied either to the Constitution itself or to a law that Congress has already passed. A president can't just invent new laws out of thin air. The pen isn't a magic wand. It's a tool to carry out laws that are already on the books.
And that leads us straight into Section 2, the President's Power Rulebook. When there's a big fight over whether a president has overstepped, the courts have a specific framework they use to decide who's right.
And that framework basically comes from this one quote. See, back in 1952, during the Korean War, President Truman tried to seize the country's steel mills to stop a strike. The case went to the Supreme Court, and they told him, no way. And Justice Robert Jackson's opinion in that case laid out the 3-part test for presidential power that we still use today.
He basically created 3 zones of power. Zone 1 is maximum power. This is when the president is doing something Congress explicitly told him he could do. Pretty much a slam dunk. Then there's Zone 3, the lowest ebb. This is when the president does something Congress is set not to do. Actions here almost always get stuck down. But the real action is in the middle, in Zone 2, the twilight zone. This is that murky area where Congress hasn't said yes or no. It's been silent. And this is where presidents really push the limits of their authority. But here's the thing, and this is a huge deal. The rules of that game have just changed dramatically. In just the last couple of years, the Supreme Court has thrown up 2 massive new hurdles that are shrinking that twilight zone, especially when it comes to big domestic policies.
First up, the end of something called the Chevron Doctrine. For 40 years, if a law was kind of vague, courts would just defer to an agency's reasonable interpretation. This gave presidents a lot of wriggle room to use old laws for new problems, like using the Clean Air Act from the 70s to regulate carbon emissions today. Well, in 2024, the Supreme Court's Loper-Bright decision threw that out. Now, courts give zero deference. Judges will decide for themselves what the best way to read the law is. That's a massive shift.
The second new hurdle is what's called the Major Questions Doctrine. And it's pretty simple, actually. It says that if a president wants an agency to do something really big, something with vast economic and political significance, they can't just point to some vague language in an old law. Congress has to have given them crystal clear, explicit permission. This is the exact doctrine that the Supreme Court used to block major policies like student loan forgiveness and vaccine mandates. So the courts are obviously a massive check on power. But as we're about to see in Section 3, Congress holds the ultimate trump card. It's called the power of the purse. So, picture this. It's January 22nd, 2009, President Obama's second day in office. He signs a very clear, very direct executive order. Close the prison at Guantanamo Bay within 1 year. Seems straightforward, right? He's the commander-in-chief. So, why is it still open today? This is why. Congress simply used its ultimate power. They stuck this one little sentence into a giant must-pass spending bill that says, basically, you can't use any money to move the detainees. That's it. The president had the order, but he didn't have a single penny to actually carry it out. It was a perfect checkmate, and it proves a fundamental truth. An executive order is just words on paper if Congress won't pay for it. Okay, so let's move on to Section 4 and see how these big, abstract rules actually play out in some very real, very recent policy fights.
Take a look at this. Student loan forgiveness, blocked by that Major Questions Doctrine. The OSHA vaccine mandate, blocked because the court said it was a broad public health rule, not a specific workplace safety rule. An immigration program called DAPA, blocked because the court said it went too far and basically created a new law. But look at the bottom. The travel ban was upheld. So why the difference? Because in that case there was an existing law, the Immigration and Nationality Act, that gave the president that specific, broad power. You see the pattern, right? On big domestic issues where Congress is silent, the president hits a wall. But where Congress has already given the green light, the president can act.
And that takes us to our last section, Section 5, which explores what might be the biggest weakness of all for executive orders. What one president can create with a pen, the next president can erase with their own.
Just look at the whiplash from something called the Mexico City Policy. It deals with funding for international NGOs. Reagan creates it, Clinton gets rid of it. Bush brings it back, Obama gets rid of it, Trump brings it back, Biden gets rid of it. This back and forth, this pendulum effect creates incredible instability. It's policy by political party, and it can change overnight.
But here's what's so fascinating. Even with that threat, most executive orders are never revoked. They become sticky. Why? Because over time they get woven into the fabric of how the government works. Industries adapt, and people start to build their lives around these rules. They develop what the courts call reliance interests. In fact, that's the very reason the Supreme Court initially stopped the Trump administration from ending DACA. They said, you can't just yank the rug out from under hundreds of thousands of people who have relied on this policy for years.
And there's another check that's become really common: lawsuits. During the Trump administration, Democratic state attorneys general filed more than 120 lawsuits to block his policies. This strategy, sometimes called lawfare, was really perfected by Republican AGs against the Obama administration, and now it's just standard operating procedure for the party that's not in the White House.
So when you put it all together, this quote really nails it. The president is the captain of the ship of state, no doubt. They have tremendous power to steer that ship, but they don't get to redesign the ocean. They can't change the currents or the weather. That power, the power to make the actual laws, still belongs to Congress.
So, if you remember one thing from all this, it's this. With the end of Chevron and the rise of the Major Questions Doctrine, we are in a new era. The president's ability to use the pen to solve big domestic problems is facing its biggest challenge since that steel mill case way back in 1952. This is a genuinely historic rebalancing of power, away from the White House and back towards Capitol Hill.
And that leaves us with a huge question for the future. As the president's pen gets weaker, what happens next? Does the gridlock get so bad that presidents start looking for new, even more creative ways to test the limits of their power? Or does this finally force presidents and Congress to do the thing the system was designed for all along? To sit down, to compromise, and to actually govern together? We'll have to wait and